strength, loyalty and survival of the James Ormiston bloodline. QO. The Ormistons are strong people. They are very worthy people. They are survivors, and maybe through this process of getting closer to the true story of James Ormiston, known as the Black Laird, we'll help to vindicate him for his loyalty to the Queens of Scotland. Back then, in the 1500s, there weren't many options for people. Life was extremely difficult, and it was not easy to survive. Let's review the history of the Ormiston surname. Ormiston is an ancient Scottish name of locational origin, deriving from either of the places called Ormiston, in the former counties of East Lothian and Roxburghshire. The place name means Orm's settlement, from the Old Norse personal name, Orma. Originally a byname meaning snake, serpent or dragon, with the Old English pre-7th century tun, enclosure, settlement. The local pronunciation of the place name is Wormston, and the modern surname can be found as Ormistony, and Ormston, the latter found mainly in Northumberland. This document describes the history of the Ormiston name going back to the first recorded spelling of the family name, to be that of Alan de Ormiston, during the reign of King William, known as the Lion of Scotland, 1165 to 1214. Surnames became necessary when governments introduced personal taxation in England. This was known as poll tax. Letter from Uncle Greg. Your dad and Uncle Greg talked quite a bit about Scotland. This is a nice letter, because Greg and Sue went to Scotland a few years before your dad did the first time, and they wanted your dad to know what places they visited and what they found. In the 4th paragraph, Greg talks about Howick, which he describes as the Ormiston stronghold from which you descend. He and your Aunt Sue toured the borders in southern Scotland. From there they went to Edinburgh, which is not far from a village named Ormiston. They stopped in Ormiston at a pub to have a beer and visit with the locals. They then went back to Howick, and here is part of what your Uncle Greg said about what they saw. There is a furniture store there owned by an Ormiston, also a prominent butcher there named Ormiston. The Teviot River flows through Howick. We never could locate the junction of the Cale and Teviot. Although there were references to the Cale in some of the old literature, the name must have been changed over the years, for it was not on any modern-day map. We were there over the May Day holiday and the library was closed. There were 2 major graveyards near Howick. The Wilton Cemetery was the first, and we found a few Ormistons buried there. There was an older cemetery and a churchyard which had been grassed over, all the markers gone. Next, we went to Melrose Abbey and found the graves referred to in some of the documents. Most of the gravestones are weather-worn, and the inscriptions are usually hard to read. The abbey has a layout of the graves, and who is buried there. I guess there were 4 or 5 Ormistons there, although, as stated, many of the markers were too worn to read. Greg said it was a pleasant trip and would recommend it. There is a book he referenced, The Steel, 1. Bonnets, that has several references to your illustrious Black Laird. Cow, I want to say something about Melrose Abbey. An abbey is a church, in this case a Catholic church. When your dad and I got to Melrose and saw the abbey, we were absolutely astonished at its size. It was massive, and it took our breath away. Many times when people died, they handed over their entire estate, all their land, to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was very powerful within the community and with the monarchy. The people who were educated back then, the ones that knew how to read and write generally speaking, were the ones that were educated by the monks and the nuns at the abbey. They didn't really have a traditional school system. And then those educated would pass down what they learned to their siblings and their own family. So, the Catholic Church kind of operated like a government, but they were a religion. And when the monarchy ran into trouble with not having enough money, they would turn to the church. 2. Notes from GDO 3, he's talking about Uncle Robert, and if you go to the genealogy page that I sent you, you will find at the bottom is Walter Ormiston, who is James Ormiston's 1515 to 1573 son by his first wife. If you keep going up the page, you'll see George Ormiston and Elizabeth Rutherford, who are James Ormiston's parents. If you look over to the right-hand side of the page, you'll see Robert Ormiston, Uncle Robert. So, George Ormiston had 2 brothers, William Ormiston and Robert Ormiston of Old Melrose. Robert Ormiston of Old Melrose is the Uncle Robert mentioned in the books. He was equerry to King James V MQ's father. Uncle Rob was in charge of the horses and stables. He was born 1505, and James Ormiston was born 1515. Uncle Robert was about 10 years older than James. Continuing on with the notes, Uncle Rob was involved in the Darnley assassination, which occurred on February 10, 1567. At that time, Uncle Rob would have been about 62 years old. Because he was implicated in the murder of Darnley, he was forced to flee his estate, which he resigned to his son John, to keep it in the family. The notes say Uncle Rob resigned his estate to his son, John Ormiston, in 1567, just prior to being outlawed for the Darnley episode. GDO III noted, no further records exist. John died in 1587, and his son in turn, parted with the Melrose estate about 1619. Then the last information here. Uncle Rob was equerry to James V, aged 14 to 26 years. I guess that was the age of the king. We'll have to figure this one out. I don't know why he stopped being in charge of the horses. But in 1542, that was the year that King James V died, following a battle with the English from complications due to his injuries. 3. Uncle Rob was on speaking conversational terms with Marie de Guise, Mary's mother, when she was regent, Dowager Queen. Dowager means title or status, generally held by the widow of a king. She was a reigning queen. The landed gentry, and notes from GDO III, which is very small print, but we'll get through it. The definition of landed gentry is, the landed gentry is simply the category of nobility that inherently includes the noble privilege of owning land. So, landed in this sense refers to land ownership, usually in the form of hamlets or country estates. The landowner very often makes a substantial income, usually through lucrative rights to fishing, shooting or hunting. QAO, so that's what I was saying last time about all of these nobles. They were assigned estates, these large pieces of land, by the king or queen, and that was their wealth basically. They did all kinds of things on the land. They had wool, which came from sheep, and just about everything they needed to survive. They wanted to get wealthier, have more land, power, and authority. So on this sheet, page 1722, I'm starting near the bottom where it states, Ormiston of that ilk, William de Ormiston c. 1244, was one of the knights who have sworn with Earl Patrick. This was Patrick III, Earl of Dunbar, grandson of the above Waltheof, and fifth cousin of William. If the latter were the son of John de Landells, the name de Landells does not appear again in the neighbourhood. Alan de Ormiston was a witness 1214-49, to a charter of John de Landells, to the Abbey of Melrose, and to a charter of Richard de Roux, remitting to the Abbey of Melrose a quit rent of 20, reserved by John in the grant, and assigned by him to Richard. In 1276, he brought a suit against the Bishop of Durham about land in Twyshil. He died in 1289. His widow, Alice, signed the Ragman Roll in 1296. GDO III. Put this as parentheses. John de Ormiston of Roxburgh, a tenant of the king, signed the Ragman Roll, his seal showing the pelicans which were the armorial bearings of the family. His lands were restored to him. Egidius de Ormiston witnessed a charter by James Lord de Douglas to Roger of Moray of lands in Fala 1321. Andrew de Ormiston held the prebend of Old Roxburgh 1337-41. He received safe conducts to visit England on business of the Douglases 1437-64. In 1348 he accompanied William de Landells, Bishop of St Andrews, on such an occasion. He was Clerk of Audit 1359-61, and Clerk of Liverance 1362. In 1378, King Robert II confirmed the grant of James de Douglas to him of 10 librates of land in Drumcourse for his lifetime. GDO III made a note here next to Robert Ormiston which says, the English records. The Ragman Rolls of Scotland were 2 documents created in 1296 and 1291 by King Edward I of England, in which prominent Scottish landowners, churchmen and burgesses swore allegiance to Edward and affixed their seals to the parchments. 4. Advise, Robert Ormiston's land in Teviotdale was granted to Nicholas Rodham, but as it was at present held by the Scottish enemy, a grant of money was made to the latter in 1391. James Ormiston of that ilk, with 2 companions, received £40 for taxing and destroying the castle of Jedburgh in 1409. In 1452 he resigned his lands to the king, who incorporated them into a barony which he granted to James's eldest son. The definition of barony is a vast private landholder. It's a large amount of land. A barony is part of the kingdom or principality. it is equivalent to a province. QAA. Now this is where Gideon III believed that James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, and Vi of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' son, gave back this large piece of land to the Ormiston family, because he knew that James Ormiston was his real father. He had been told this by one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting, and it was right after he became King James I of England and James VI of Scotland that he started cleaning up all of the rivalry, especially along the borders between England and Scotland. King James was trying to show his appreciation to the Ormiston family and wanted to return what belonged to them. So the timing of the grant of land is what led Gideon III to believe that King James VI knew who his real father was, and that the king had made a commitment to return the land to the Ormiston family in 1603 once he became King James I of England and Vi of Scotland. Continuing on, top right column. George Ormiston of that ilk, who in the treaties of 1457 and 1459-60 between the kings of England and Scotland was designated a conservator troigai. His son, Andrew Ormiston of that ilk, obtained a settlement of his barony in 1464, with succession to his brothers James, Nicholas, ancestor of the Ormistons of Easter Muirdean, and Bartholomew. He married Janetta de Cranstoun and obtained a fresh settlement 1471-72. He brought a suit about 1494 and was dead in 1496-7. Besides a son George and a dow, Margaret, who John Fallow of that ilk he had, Robert Ormiston of that ilk, mentioned in the second settlement above, who Elizabeth Rutherford, and was dead before 1505 when she, then the wife of Alexander Hateley, sued for her terce. He had issue. 1. George, heir to his father. 2. Robert of Old Melrose, of whom hereafter. 3. William of Westhouses. George Ormiston of that ilk was served heir to his father 1510-11. His Tower of Ormiston was destroyed by Dacre in 1523. He was taken prisoner at Solway Moss 1542 and was dead by 1542-43. He had with other issue, 1. James, of whom hereafter. 2. Andrew, the first colonel of the Scots Brigade in the Netherlands, killed in a duel by his successor in 1574. 5. James Ormiston of that ilk, the Black Laird Cecine 1550, was concerned in the assassination of King Henry Darnley February 1567, for which the Earl of Bothwell was tried and acquitted in April. In May, Bothwell was created Duke of Orkney, and Ormiston was knighted. In December they, with others, were again tried and attainted, and their estates were forfeited. Ormiston was captured in November 1573 and 14 Dec. About 1567 he as second wife Margaret, widow of John Sinclair of Herdmaston. By his first wife he had a son, Walter, who as a minor was sued in 1564. Walter M. Grisel, Dow, of John Rutherford of Hunthill. Ormiston of Old Melrose, page 1722, second column. Robert Ormiston of Old Melrose, second son of Robert Ormiston of that ilk, was one of the king's equerries, 1526-38. He was associated with his nephew James, in the assassination of King Henry Darnley in 1567, was tried with him and attainted, having previously resigned his estate to his son, John Ormiston, in 1564, who was stated to be dead in 1587 in a suit against his son. Robert Ormiston, then a minor, who was served heir to his father in 1606. He had parted with his estate about 1619. He Mary Ramsay, and with other issue had a son. The Ormistons of Teviotdale Book, page 12. I am copying this close to verbatim with the added notes, and will try to organize by paragraphs. There is a lot of phrasing, partial sentences and old Scottish words, so I think it is important to leave it in its present state, and try to decipher it. At Jedburgh signed James Ormstone of YT Ilk WT, my ein hand at ye pen and see. However, on 3 December 1549, at the instance of Sir Walter Scott of Branxholme summons, was issued against him and others for assisting Patrick, 5th Lord Grey, Lieutenant of the North Parts of England and the English Army, and spoiling, burning, Anxi. 6 September 1550, account was taken of £7 for the barony of Ormiston, for 2d in silver for the duplication of the 144 alba firma of the same. For £10 for 20 sick mercates of land in Maxton called Govansland, and for £20 for the relief of the same for Cécine given to James Ormiston. On 9th July 1550, he was member of the Assize which valued certain lands granted to 143, William Rutherford of Langnewton, formerly held by Patrick Earl of Bothwell, with right of re-entry reserved to the Earl. The Cécine Register. The older type of register in Scotland is a chronological list of land deeds. The property description is followed by a list and short description of deeds submitted for registration. These provide an account of all transactions that have taken place on the property. 6. Gideon Thread made a note important next to this paragraph. On 26 March 1551, he signed an agreement 145 at Roxburgh, called the Old Band of Roxburgh, dated 1560. As surety for him on 5 July 1551, Walter Scott of Sinton 146 bound himself to pay 250 marks to his uncle Robert Ormiston of the New Hall, or of Old Melrose. On 2 August 1552, Robert resigned to James Ormiston, the Tynes of New Hall and Sinlawis, Robert's brother 147 William being witness. On 22 January 1554, he signed for himself, and as surety 148, for Adam and Charles Rutherford to refrain from molesting Walter Kerr of Cessford and 3 other Kerrs, and to be of good behaviour as regards both England and Scotland. This is the first mention of a long-existing feud between James Ormiston and Kerr of Cessford. On 6 February 1554, he was member of an inquest returning Walter Scott as heir to his grandfather Walter Scott of 149 Branksholme. In December 1559, he writes to 150 the Foresters describing himself as bailiff to Lord Bothwell. Gideon III made a note here. The original copy of this letter is in the British Archives. On 20th January 1560, the Regent wrote to Secretary Maitland, asking him to send 2 enclosed letters, apparently from 151 France for the Queen, to James Ormiston with haste. In the same year with the Duke of Châtelherault and many notables, he, 152, joined the English army. On 29 August 1560, Randolph writes to Cecil that James Ormiston would shortly be with Cecil. The Duke sends him to convey his son secretly out of France. He himself shall come to you, his servant Nisbet shall ride straight away before to bring the Duke's 153 son to the border or into Flanders where Ormiston shall receive him. Another letter from Randolph to Cecil has 2 enclosures. One states that at the border court at 154 Jedburgh, some disorder was committed before both wardens by James Ormiston and John Rutherford of the Know. The Lord Lieutenant warded them both pending punishment. The other letter dated 10th of December 1560 gives the names of those at the Dunbar Convention, including the Laird of Ormiston. It adds that on the day of truce at Ridingburn, he, Ormiston, was charged with the reset of stolen English oxen. He challenged his accuser to fight and cast his glove at him. Till the matter could be decided, they were commanded to ward, one at St Andrews and the other at St Johnstone's. On 14th March 1561, Randolph again writes to Cecil that Aaron 155 intends shortly to send a special man, namely James Ormiston, to solicit such matters as he has to confer with the King. 7. Of France and the Constable. This Aaron was James Hamilton, 2nd Earl of Arran and Duke of Châtelherault, Regent of Scotland, who had projected a marriage between his son and Queen Mary. In 1561, there is a record of the expenses 156 of a pursuivant taking the Queen's charge to James Ormiston, Walter Scott of Ideshaw, and other to subscribe a letter of assurance between the Scots and the Kerrs. The Ormistons of Teviotdale Book, page 13. Gideon Thread noted, Mary now in Scotland. On 25 October 1561, James Ormiston and others appeared at the palace in Edinburgh and in the Queen's presence, received their valentines of the names of persons culpable of theft and other crimes, and were ordered to seize them and take them before the justice at Jedburgh, and to 157 report compliance in Edinburgh on the 6th November. Following. Jamieson's Scots Dictionary defines a valentine as a sealed letter sent by royal authority for the purpose of apprehending disorderly persons. On 4th December at the palace in Edinburgh, James Ormiston and other gentlemen appeared before the Queen and her Privy Council, and confessed that they had contravened the bond given by them for suppressing 158 theft and had incurred the penalties thereof. In 1562, The Islay Herald conveyed the Queen's charge to James Ormiston to enter 159, his person in ward within the town of Perth, within 6 days. GDO 3rd noted, important strange location. However, on 30th May 1562, 160, Queen Mary wrote to the Laird of Ormiston, requesting him to prepare to accompany her into England and explaining that, as she and her whole retinue were to be in mourning for her widowhood, it would be necessary for him and his company to be dressed accordingly. This mourning was for Mary's husband, King Francis II of France, who had died on 5th December 1560. GDO 3rd noted, important. 45. Before this, on 21st May, 1562, in a 161 dispute about the house of the Earl of Bothwell at Ancram, Sir Walter Kerr of Cessford and Sir Andrew Kerr of Cavertonk his son, bound themselves not to enter the house or molest Bothwell the Earl and his tenants. James Ormiston, who had lately entered into possession, was ordered to vacate it by the following Monday, and to leave only one ploughman to work the land. Ormiston had an interest in land at Ancram, possibly through his wife, GDO 3rd noted, a Sinclair, as on 28 July 1564, 162 Agnes Waldheim, relict of Matthew Windygates in Ancram Mill, sued Walter Ormiston's son and heir of James Ormiston of that ilk, and his father as his tutor, to desist from keeping her out of the mill. In this year it was stated that there was a particularly 163 deadly fight and actionis betwixt Walter Kerr of Cessford, knight, and James Ormiston of that ilk, anent the taking of the said 8. Laird of Ormistoun of the landis of neither Ancram, and bailey thereof in Ancram, tackar over the said Laird of Cessford's hide, it being his kindly Rome of before, as he alleges, and anent the slaughter of Umquil. Best, GDO 3rd noted, given name servant to the said Laird of Cessford. Kerr's grandfather married Christian daughter, and his grandaunt Elizabeth married a son of James Rutherford of that ilk, while Ormiston's mother and grandmother were Rutherfords, so that Kerr and Ormiston were cousins in some degree. Previously a bond called the Auld Band of Roxburgh, dated 23rd March 1564, GDO 3rd noted. Also Sinclair relationship to Bothwell refers to this feud 164, which was referred to arbitration, and Walter Scott of Branxholme gave security for Ormiston. Later Sir Walter Kerr of Cessford, warden of the Middle Marches, complained that the gentry refused to appear and help him when required. So on 28 September 1564, an order was sent to the provosts of Jedburgh, Selkirk and Peebles and 35 gentlemen, including the 165 Laird of Ormiston, that they were to obey and help the warden. On 12 November 1565, Randolph writes to Cecil that James Ormiston has come from the Duke. GDO 3 notes, Bothwell with his submission, and I think it shall not be hard to have his 166 pardon granted. On 21st and 23rd December 1565, James Ormiston of that ilk and Uncle Robert Ormiston of Old Melrose, his father's brother and surety, entered into an obligation to David Spottiswoode of that ilk and John Spottiswoode his second son. 167. QAO. Now let's review the events relating to Queen Mary and Darnley who marry. There comes a time when Darnley is out of control after the wedding. Darnley had made enemies of most all the Scottish nobles. He was constantly threatening people, and he was immature. He made Mary look bad. She really didn't want to have anything to do with him. She had to be kind to him because he was such a problem, and she was pregnant, not by him, and she was fearful he was going to let everyone know. I do not think the nobles knew she was pregnant, but Darnley had become a big risk for them because of all his threats as king. The nobles had a meeting and decided they were going to do something about it, and they all jumped in as far as this Darnley murder. There were 4 or 5 different plots to do away with him, whether it be by fire, by strangling, by suffocating, by blowing up the building, or other means on that particular day. And so one way or the other, this man was not going to survive the night. Bothwell was involved. He was supposed to get the gunpowder and stage it underneath the apartment where Darnley was staying that night at Kirkhofield. The plan was to have a long train of gunpowder. 3 sources number 151 CSP, I number 613 P286, 152 grams, 105, number 150 LBP, 86, 73 in reprint Doubleday USA. Number 153 CSP, I number 895 P47, Notes, CSP equal to Calendar of State Papers relating to Scotland. #GH's History of Scotland, Vol. 6th. Patrick Fraser Titler 7 vols, 1840. LB, equal to Lord Bothwell, by Robert G. Brown, London 1837, 9. That somebody was going to have to light the fuse at some point, and it would burn all the way to the gunpowder barrels from underneath the apartment, and then explode. And that was where James Ormiston got involved, I guess. And I don't think he knew exactly what the plots were about. Because according to GDO3, James Ormiston had gone to bed that night, and then somebody came knocking at his door. He was told that he was needed to light the fuse to the gunpowder. So he went in his nightgown with them, which is rather odd. This does not seem like someone who knew what was going on. James was not even dressed properly. What's also interesting to me is the same year that Darnley was killed is the same year that Mary is pregnant again. And so what's happening is, she's married, but she and Darnley are not intimate. From the very beginning, there's a belief that they were not having sexual relations. It was like a consensual marriage, an arranged marriage, and the agreement was that he could be with whomever he wanted, and Mary could live her life as she saw fit. They actually lived separately. That was common back then for kings and queens to have their own bedrooms and not necessarily be together. So, that's the way it started out. And everyone seemed happy. Darnley was more involved with men, and he was also very sick with what seemed to be the pox, and so Mary really didn't want to be around him that much. She needed a husband, but she wasn't really in love with him. So she tried to keep her distance, and she didn't want her child to get sick. So she kept little James away from Darnley. He was being taken care of by midwives and women that took care of the monarchy's children. So GDO III believes that Mary got pregnant again in December or January of 1567, and that Darnley became aware of it. Darnley is asking himself, who is the father? I'm the husband, but I'm not the father. By this time Darnley had become pretty unruly. He was partying and drinking much of the time. He was upset too, that Mary was spending so much of her time with her French friends, musicians and poets that would come visit her. So he was, like I said, getting out of control, and I think he threatened to tell people the child she was carrying was not his. First off, I believe it was still a secret that she was pregnant, but she felt very threatened by the possibility of him communicating anything with the people. This is why the plots are now going on. Mary's got her reasons, because she's trying to hide the fact that he's not the father. And then the other nobles have their reasons, because Darnley's angered them all. They all had reason to want him to be gone. It also intrigues me that James Ormiston got married to his second wife in 1567, the very year Darnley was killed. Queen Mary was probably not very pleased about that. James O probably married his second wife sometime after Darnley was killed in February. I do not know the exact date. Anyhow, GDO III believed James O really loved his wife, and I think Queen Mary was pursuing James O. These are assumptions on our part. But I tend to believe GDO III that he probably had read enough, and figured that there were no other men close to her that she would be getting pregnant by. 10. Mary, Queen of Scots and the Murder of Lord Darnley, book. Page 255 is missing. Top of page 256 reads, for Darnley, and no preparations for the murder were made before then, as Ormiston later testified under interrogation. Moray's journal claims that Mary waited at Linlithgow until Ormiston brought her news that Bothwell was on his way to Edinburgh. Mary and Bothwell did arrive back in Edinburgh around the same date, but this may have been by coincidence rather than collusion. Mary and Darnley approached the outskirts of Edinburgh either on 30 January or on one of the next 2 days. Bothwell came to meet them and escort them to Craigmillar. But at the last minute, either through fear that he might be imprisoned or murdered behind the castle's stout walls, or because Craigmillar was inconvenient to his own plans, Darnley declared he did not wish to complete his convalescence there, and it was decided that he should go instead to the old provost's lodging at Kirko Field, a country house near the city, and a place of good air where he might best recover his health. The hasty preparations made for Darnley's reception confirm that this was a last-minute change of plan. Page 257. Lennox claims that, when Darnley complained that he misliked the other house that she prepared for him, Mary took him by the hand and said that, although that house was fair in his sight, yet the rooms of the other were more easy and handsome for him, and also for her, that there passed a privy way between the palace and it, where she might always resort unto him till he was whole of his disease. At which Darnley, being bent to follow her will in all things, yielded to the same, and so entered the house. The privy way that Mary referred to was a back route through the grounds of the nearby Blackfriars Monastery, which gave access to a lane leading to Kirkhoe Field. Gideon III put a check mark next to this sentence, probably because the privy way allowed Mary and others to access Darnley without it being known to everyone. In choosing this lodging, wrote Buchanan, Mary wished it to appear that her reason was the salubrity of it. He made it appear, however, that she had a more underhand purpose. But there is evidence that Kirkhoe Field was not the Queen's choice. Now, who may well have gotten his information from Mary, states that Darnley himself chose Kirkhoe Field on the report of Sir James Balfour, whose brother owned the old provost's lodging, and some others. This was against the Queen's wishes, who was anxious to take him to Craigmillar, for he could not stay in Holyrood Palace, lest he should give the infection to the prince. On his own account, too, he did not wish anyone to see him in his present condition, nor until he had gone through a course of baths in private. If Balfour was Darnley's accomplice in his treasonous schemes, then, it has been argued, his purpose in suggesting Kirkhoe Field may indeed have been a sinister one. It is possible that the treacherous Balfour was conspiring with both Darnley and the Protestant lords. The fact that Balfour advised the king to go to Kirkhoe Field perhaps suggests that he was the driving force behind Darnley's plotting. Gideon III put A11 checkmark next to this sentence, probably because he agrees with it. In his confession, John Hepburn also claims that Balfour suggested Kirkhoe Field. Bothwell states that Darnley's sojourn there was by common consent of the Queen and her council, who were anxious to preserve the health of all concerned. Gideon III put a checkmark next to this sentence, probably because he agrees with it. Page 316. In Scotland, rumours were spread by the regicides to the effect that the king had been murdered by the means of Moray and Morton. There certainly were rumours to that effect, and some probably had their basis in truth. It was widely rumoured that the principal persons in the kingdom were implicated because they were dissatisfied with the king. Gideon III made a note, yes, and above all, a bastard brother of the Queen's is suspected, because at the time when she was at variance with her husband, Moray, the bastard, told Mary that Darnley had boasted to Moray of having had intimacy with Mary before she was his wife. The Queen, exasperated, asked Darnley if it was true. The king, Darnley, gave the lie to the bastard Moray, who repeated the accusation to Darnley's face. From this private quarrel, the report arose that the bastard had desired to avenge himself. Gideon III made a note. At this time Moray was going insane over the planned marriage. It may have been this incident that initially caused the rift between Darnley and Moray. But Moray had far more and greater reasons than that for wishing to be rid of Darnley. Mary herself was always to believe that the Protestant lords had been behind the plot. Now, whose work almost certainly reflects her views, stated that it was afterwards made public that the murder had been done by the command and device of the Earls of Bothwell and Morton, James Balfour and some others, who always afterwards pretended to be most diligently searching out the murder which they themselves had committed. Gideon III made a note, yes, which means that he agrees with that comment. Page 317. But Morton was regent of Scotland at the time and one of Mary's most virulent enemies. Now also states that if we may judge by the plots, deeds and contrivances of Bothwell's associates, it would seem that after having used Bothwell to rid themselves of Darnley, they designed to make Bothwell their instrument to ruin the Queen. Elsewhere, in speaking of the lords, now refers to the murder which they themselves had committed, and speaks of Bothwell, Morton and Balfour as the guilty parties. Gideon III underlined this sentence and wrote, right, with a big exclamation point next to it. In January 1568, Hepburn and Hay in their confessions accused the greatest and chiefest of Moray's council, who were at that time sitting beside him, especially Morton, Lethington and Balfour, and their own master the Earl Bothwell of the murder. A report in the Secret Archives, 12, of the Society of Jesus claimed that Maitland was present at this conference between Moray and one of the prisoners who is not named, and being very far-sighted, he feared that if the criminal were permitted to make a public confession, he would name him, or some of his accomplices for Lethington's conscience, accused him of many crimes. Maitland therefore prepared a speech for the condemned man to recite on the scaffold, but to his dismay, the wretch refused, saying he had reached that frame of mind when threats and compliments are equally worthless, and that nothing should hinder him from saying what his conscience told him to say. Addressing Moray, he said, "Since you, my Lord Regent, occupy the position in which I now find you, of you I will say nothing, and I spare you because of your dignity." Then, turning to Maitland and some others who are not named, he asked, "Who is there among you who either can or dare accuse me of this crime? A crime of which you are quite as guilty as I am. For you planned what these lords of mine put into execution, as is attested by the signatures of all of you, which would establish the truth of all my words if they could be produced." At his words, all were so struck that for a time there was silence. On the scaffold, whatever charges he brought openly against the secretary, the Earls of Morton and Bothwell and James Balfour, whom he affirmed to be the first inventors of this crime, the very same he insinuated sufficiently plainly against Moray. Everyone who knows anything about this affair knows how true is the statement made about him and the others mentioned. Page 318, the man concerned may have been Hay for, on the scaffold, Hay incriminated Maitland, Bothwell, Huntley, Argyle and Balfour, stating that Balfour and Maitland were notoriously known as the principal advisers and counsellors, and although he had not seen Morton's signature on the Craigmillar bond, Bothwell had told him it was there. The report in the Jesuit archives states that the other men executed that day bore witness not only that the Queen was guiltless of this crime, but that the individuals mentioned above were the authors of the King's murder. Buchanan also says that both Maitland and Balfour, it is believed, were privy to the plot to murder the King. In his confession, John Binning accused Maitland's brother John of also being involved. Many believe that Morton had helped to commit the murder, and his indictment of 1581 asserts that he had personally placed the gunpowder under the ground and angular stones and within the vaults of Darnley's house. But in his confession, made that same year, Morton would only admit to having foreknowledge of the murder, not to taking any part in it. He added that nothing had been done to prevent the murder because it was known that the Queen desired it. Morton was not in Edinburgh when it was committed, yet his kinsmen were at the scene of the crime. Possibly Archibald Douglas was there on his own initiative, but his intervention may well have had Morton's blessing. Morton admitted having received Douglas after the murder, even though he knew Douglas had been involved in it. Yet the evidence collectively suggests that in his confession, Morton was telling the truth. When he was found guilty in 1581 of being art and part in the murder, he showed himself much grieved, and beating the ground once or twice with his staff, said, "Art and part? God knoweth the contrary." 13. Huntley and Argyle were certainly involved in the conspiracy, according to Morton's confession. Huntley went with Bothwell to Kirkfield on the night of the murder, while Argyle was in Edinburgh at the time. He had allegedly patted Paris's shoulder after the preparations for the explosion were completed. There is no reliable evidence to connect any other noble with the murder. Glencairn, Fleming, Kirkcaldy of Grange, Livingston, Melville, Eglinton and Athol were definitely not involved. Another man who was to be executed for complicity in Darnley's murder was Archbishop Hamilton. Buchanan was especially eager to condemn him for it. Page 319, the Archbishop had been in residence in the Duke's house on the night of the murder, and it is from Buchanan that we learn the seemingly ominous detail of the light being extinguished in the window after the explosion. Buchanan claims that the good bishop not only conspired with the Earl Bothwell, but came with the Queen to Glasgow and conveyed the King to the place of his murder, the bishop being lodged as he was seldom or never before, where he might perceive the pleasure of that cruelty, and help the murderers, and sent 4 of his familiar servants to the execution of the murder, watching all the night and thinking long to have the joy of the coming of the crown, a degree nearer to the house of Hamilton. QAO. So basically Archbishop Hamilton would be glad that Darnley was gone, because the Hamilton family is next in line to the monarchy, or close to the royal line. Page 319, Buchanan was a staunch Lennox man and hated the Hamiltons. Furthermore, Buchanan, having elsewhere alleged that the murder was the work of Bothwell and Mary, asserts that the Archbishop, when the proposition of killing the King was made to him, willingly undertook it, both by reason of old feuds between their families, and also out of hopes thereby to bring the kingdom nearer to his family. Upon which he chose out 6 or 8 of the most wicked of his vassals and commended the matter to them. The earlier account there were 4 vassals, and they were sent to assist the murderers, not do the deed. The Archbishop gave them the keys to the King's lodging, and they then entered very silently into his chamber, and strangled him when he was asleep. And when they had so done, they carried out his body through a little gate into an orchard adjacent to the walls, and then a sign was given to blow up the house. In his eagerness to incriminate an old enemy, Buchanan temporarily forgot about Bothwell and about the deposition of the Earl's accomplices, which he himself had published. But Lennox was regent at the time this was written, and it was politic to blacken the reputation of the Hamiltons. After Darnley's murder, Mary is pretty much on her own, and we'll get to the details as we go through the story. Mary is threatened by the Lord's nobles and is taken to an island. The appearance is that she is imprisoned on this island, in a small castle, because she's being charged as being complicit in the Darnley murder. She's being held responsible. But 14. Before this she is supposedly abducted, kidnapped by Bothwell. Page 396. After Darnley's death, Lennox, Darnley's father, had decided that it was unsafe for him to remain in Scotland, and was even now at Dumbarton. Waiting to sail down the Clyde for England, his ship finally left on 29 April. On 23 April, having obtained his information from a well-informed source, he wrote to tell his wife that Bothwell was about to kidnap the Queen. Lennox's intelligence was correct. Now says that having secured the support of the Lords for his proposed marriage, and seeing the difficulties which would arise from delay, Bothwell resolved by some means or other to seize the person of the Queen, and then, having already gained the consent of all the Lords, to compel her to give hers, in order to bring the negotiations to a conclusion. Bothwell was well aware that he had enemies, and doubtless believed that marriage to Mary would afford him a degree of protection, especially since he had the written backing of the Lords. Bothwell was an ambitious man, and keen to consolidate the power he already enjoyed. Whether the Queen was about to collude in her own abduction is another matter. Page 397. Given the way that events were moving, it is hardly surprising that on the 23rd of April Cecil wrote, "Scotland is in a quagmire. Nobody seems to stand still, the most honest desire to go away, the worst tremble with the shaking of their conscience." On the day Lennox wrote his letter, Mary said farewell to her child, not realizing that she would never see him again, and left Stirling for Linlithgow with Maitland, Huntly, Melville and her 30 horses. 4 miles out of Stirling, the Queen suffered a severe attack of abdominal pain, and had to rest in a cottage before completing her journey. The royal party did not arrive at Linlithgow Palace until late that night. That day, Bothwell had ridden 12 miles southwest of Edinburgh to Calder Castle, where he raised a force of 800 horse, ostensibly intending to lead them south to Biggar. At midnight, according to Drury, he visited Huntly at Linlithgow to ask for his assistance in the abduction of the Queen, but a horrified Huntly refused. After an hour of fruitless persuasion, Bothwell left without seeing Mary, and when he got back to Calder, he was in great ill humour. Paris, who was kind of like a servant, in his second deposition, claimed that Black Ormiston visited Linlithgow secretly that night, and that he had a long conversation with the Queen. Now this is key right here, for James Ormiston to be able to see Mary, at the castle secretly at night, and have a long conversation with the Queen. Now what do you think that might be about? Isn't that interesting that they would be meeting in the middle of the night? She's a queen, very unusual. Page 397. It is more than likely that Paris's story was fabricated, in order to make it appear that Mary had colluded in the abduction. If Mary had connived at the abduction, Bothwell would surely have finalized the details with her himself before she left Edinburgh, or when he visited. 15. Linlithgow. There was no need to send Ormiston. But see, the reason James Ormiston went is because of her relationship with him. You might want to read this part carefully. So when you think about it, why would he be going to see her, rather than Bothwell, who's been in charge of leading the efforts? I think that James was telling her, based on what Gideon III told me, that this is the plan. You, Queen Mary, have to go along with the plan. We're going to get you out of here. This is how we're going to do it. And, in the end, it didn't save her. But James was there to tell Mary what the plan was. Page 397. The question of whether Mary did in fact collude in the abduction is another matter entirely. But there were those who believed, or affected to believe, that she did. At midnight, while Bothwell was arguing with Huntly, Grange was writing to Bedford, "This is to advise you that Bothwell's wife is going to part with her husband, and great part of our lords have subscribed the marriage between the Queen and him." Page 455. The casket letters. On the day the casket was allegedly opened, or the day before, Robert Melville was sent to London to explain the Lord's actions to Elizabeth. There is no direct evidence that he took with him secret information about the casket letters, although Maitland did write to Cecil stating that the Lord's messenger would explain the reasons why he had taken sides against the Queen. Maitland, however, had taken sides against Mary 15 days before the alleged discovery of the casket. He also said in his letter that the best part of the nobility had resolved to look narrowly into Bothwell's doings, and being by them required, I would not refuse to join me to them in so just and reasonable a cause. He also asked Cecil for English money to finance the Lord's coup. More than 3 years later, Randolph was to report that around this time, another casket was found in Edinburgh Castle. This was said to have been a small coffer covered with green cloth, which contained a copy of the Craig Miller bond, and it was discovered, probably in Bothwell's apartments, by Balfour and Maitland. Needless to say, this copy of the bond was suppressed. On 25 June, Drury referred to a casket. There is news here that the Queen had a box, wherein are the practices between her and France, wherein is little good meant to England. Given the timing of this dispatch, it is certainly possible, even likely, that Drury was talking about the silver casket opened by the Lords, which was found to contain only diplomatic documents. If it had contained more contentious matter, the Lords would certainly have informed Drury of it, for they needed to justify their actions to Queen Elizabeth, whose reaction they feared. Drury again mentions this box in a report sent on 29 June, in which he says that the partly coded documents in it have been deciphered. Again, there is no mention of their supposedly dramatic content. On 21st June, the day the casket was purportedly opened, the Lords sat in council, but no mention was in the minutes of the casket or its contents. 16. Page 459. Mary's servants, Sebastian Pages and Fra de Busseau, were imprisoned in the Tolbooth, but they were quickly released, as was Black John Spens, after he had delivered Bothwell's treasure chest to the Lords. It may be inferred from this that not all these interrogations had to do with Darnley's murder. Possibly through Balfour's good offices, Captain Cullen was also freed, without having made any deposition, which is very strange, considering he had earlier uttered the whole manner of the murder, and had probably been present at Kirkhoe Field. Presumably, what he had uttered was in reality of little importance, although it had suited the Lords to declare otherwise. In Paris, Sir Anthony Standen heard of the fate of the Queen and Bothwell, and of the subsequent arrests, and decided it was safer to spend his life in exile. In the event, this banishment endured 30 years or more. The younger Standen remained in Scotland, but was imprisoned for a year in Berwick for remaining loyal to the Queen. Black Ormiston and his uncle went into hiding in the Borders. The fate of Robert Ormiston is unknown, but his nephew survived to play a role in the Northern Rising of 1569-70 against Queen Elizabeth. On 29 June, Mary's supporters at Dumbarton, notably Huntley, Argyll, Bishop Leslie, Seaton, Fleming and the Hamiltons, signed a bond to liberate her. Page 460. Such a coalition posed a threat to the Lords, so this would have been the optimum moment to produce the casket letters in order to inflame public feeling against the Queen. But the Lords did no such thing. Queen Elizabeth had been outraged and incensed to hear of Mary's imprisonment. Of the Scottish Lords she fulminated, "They have no warrant nor authority by the law of God or man, to be as superiors, judges or vindicators over their prince and sovereign. Howsoever they do gather or conceive matter of disorder against her, we are determined that we will take plain part with them to revenge their sovereign for an example to all posterity. Though she were guilty of all they charge her with, I cannot assist them while their queen is imprisoned." In her anger, Elizabeth's first impulse was to declare war, but a horrified Cecil dissuaded her. He and his fellow councillors were in no way dismayed by what had happened north of the border, and realized that it was to England's benefit to have in Scotland a Protestant government desperate to build friendly relations with its neighbour. Yet Elizabeth had a different agenda. At the end of June, she decided to send that experienced diplomat, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, to Scotland to bring about Mary's immediate restoration by persuasion, treaty or force, and a reconciliation between her and her lords. Once that had been achieved, Throckmorton was to demand that Darnley's murderers be hunted down and tried. At the same time, he was to persuade the Scots to agree to Prince James being brought up in England as Elizabeth's ward. Finally, he was to see Mary and deliver to her an encouraging message from Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth's hope that, in return for her restoration, Mary would ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh. 17. Not surprisingly, a gloomy and reluctant Throckmorton told Leicester that this was the most dangerous legation in my life. He knew, all too well, that the Scots would not take kindly to English interference in their affairs. It is often claimed that, by her intervention, Elizabeth probably saved Mary's life, for, had she given the Lords her support, they might well have executed their queen. However, as has been noted, they had no legal basis on which they could do so, short of putting her on trial, which carried the risk of her publicly exposing their own guilt. There were, however, other ways of disposing of inconvenient sovereigns, and these lords had not hesitated when it came to getting rid of Darnley. Throckmorton would soon reach the opinion that they meant to do away with Mary as well. It was the covert, page 461 assassination of her cousin that Elizabeth almost certainly prevented. Alone or all the monarchs of Europe, the Queen of England, Mary's dynastic rival, was her champion at this time. Nonetheless, she, Elizabeth, was shocked to hear reports that Mary was pregnant, for it was obvious that the child must have been conceived out of wedlock. QAO, this is the first instance I have seen it written in a book that Mary was pregnant, obviously out of wedlock. This points to why Mary married Bothwell, and it becomes more believable Bothwell's scheme for himself to elevate his position to king for his protection for being accused of killing Darnley and to cover who the real father was to Mary's child. Page 461. If the reports were confirmed, she declared pessimistically, "It will be thought all was not well before." It is unlikely that Elizabeth had much sympathy with Mary on a personal level. She told Throckmorton she had almost decided to deal no more with her by way of advice, but look on her as a person desperate to recover her honour. Elizabeth was more concerned to protect the institution of monarchy, and in particular female monarchy, which Mary, by her apparently rash behaviour, had undermined. Before he left London, Throckmorton saw the Lennoxes. "My lady wept bitterly, my lord sighed deeply," he wrote. Lennox was already working in secret for Mary's abdication, and in July, he returned to Scotland. On 1 July, Throckmorton left London in a pessimistic mood, and travelled north with a heavy heart, only to be overtaken by a royal courier who urged him to make haste. Meanwhile, on 30th June, the Confederate Lords had issued a summons in Mary's name, ordering Bothwell and his accomplices to appear in the Tolbooth on 22 August to answer charges in connection with the King's murder and the abduction of the Queen, or otherwise be put to the horn, the Scottish term for outlawed. The next day, Melville informed Cecil that Balfour was now in daily council with the Council of Confederate Lords, along with James McGill, the former clerk register. Robert Melville had 18. Just returned to Scotland, and was sent immediately by the Lords to the Queen at Lochleven to persuade her to abdicate or divorce Bothwell, but she refused to contemplate either. However, she said she was willing for the Lords to continue pursuing Darnley's murderers. On 2 July, the Pope, having learned of the Bothwell marriage, broke off relations with Mary. He did not know, he said, which of the two queens in Britain was the worse, and announced that it was not his intention to have any further communications with the Queen of Scots, unless in times to come, he shall see some better sign of her life and religion than he has witnessed in the past. Love Affairs of Queen Mary, Book, QAO. This is from the book Love Affairs of Queen Mary, and this is the chapter on Lochleven. Lochleven is that little place, small castle, on the island of a lake that Mary supposedly was imprisoned at due to being involved in the Darnley murder. In reality, she was also pregnant. She needed to carry out the pregnancy in a secluded place. There have been other instances where queens, including Queen Elizabeth of England, have gotten pregnant outside of a marriage. This topic has been talked about, written in books, and put into movies. It would be said that the Queen was on progress, which is to say she has gone on a long trip to visit other parts of the country in the name of progress for their country. The nobles used Mary's condition, being pregnant, to their advantage. They of course want to control Scotland without Mary, and are using every force they can to take away her title. See photos and map below of Lochleven, page 404. When therefore Kirkcaldy grew threatening toward Mary, Lethington was able to produce what purported to be a letter written by Mary to Bothwell that night and intercepted. Gideon III has crossed out Bothwell, probably because he believes Mary's letter is intended for Ormiston. He talked to me about this. Dear heart, the letter ran. I will never forget or abandon you, though I need be absent from you for a time. Be comforted and on your guard, for your safety's sake did I send you away from me. Whether Mary wrote the letter or not, who shall say? For it was never produced subsequently, but it served its turn, and the very children in the streets cried shame upon the woman who thus clave to the murderer of her husband. Kirkcaldy pleaded still. Give her time, he said. She will forget him by and by, and she had already left him. When she did forget him, replied Morton, they would think about it, but their lives and lands depended upon her being in safekeeping in the meantime. Mary in her pride and anger, and still with a lingering love for Bothwell. Ormiston may well have refused in the first days of captivity wholly to abandon thoughts of the man she had married. The story is that Bothwell abducted her, takes her to his castle, and took advantage of 19. Her, which is why she's pregnant. So now she has to marry him. You know, the plot thickens, right? Of course, Mary is going to say that she loved Bothwell. Bothwell, of course, knows who the father is and is willing to play this role. Because he and Ormiston are kinsmen, related to each other through the Sinclair women they married, or their relatives married. Bothwell is also trying to protect Ormiston. Page 404. The Lords at least gave out that she swore she would never consent to his punishment, and had vowed to touch no meat until she should see him again. Actually Bothwell ends up fleeing Scotland. He gets on a ship, and goes over to the Netherlands I believe and kind of disappears. He gets caught over there, and put in prison. Bothwell is recognized by the father, of a well-known prominent family, of one of his past loves, whom he had promised to marry, but instead left the country. Bothwell gets put in prison, and he never comes out. It's really a tragic story. Page 404. With such stories, true or false, the traitors work their will. The streets rang with the cry, burn her, kill her, drown her. And late at night on the 16th of June, the Queen of Scots was smuggled out of the city to the island fortress in Loch Leven, to ponder at her leisure on the base treachery of which she had been a victim. To add one more touch to her martyrdom, she was warded at Loch Leven by Murray's mother, her own father's mistress, and her son, William Douglas, Morton's close kinsman. Mary's conduct in shutting her eyes if she did nothing worse to what she must have known was the intended murder of Darnley was shameful, and according to the ethics of today, monstrous. But she did not suffer for this offence, her punishment at the hands of men more guilty of a crime than she. That was the excuse they needed to arouse against her the indignation of the people both in Scotland and abroad, to afford Murray and Morton the opportunity of usurping power. And afterwards to provide Elizabeth with a means of reducing Mary's international importance. Her real offence, in the eyes of the mass of the nobles who persecuted and deposed her, was in clinging to the blackguard with whom she had fallen in love. Even after he had shown by his actions that he intended to use his position as consort for the purpose of dwarfing his wife, of ousting from the government the rest of the nobles, and of monopolizing the power himself. The providential discovery of the casket papers in the hands of a retainer of Bothwell's, who had obtained them from the castle by his master's orders, only 3 days after Mary's deportation to Loch Leven, were placed in the hands of Morton. 4. This George Dalgleish, with Ormiston, Powrie, Hepburn of Boughton, Captain Blacketer, and other henchmen of Bothwell, was shortly afterwards hanged for complicity in Darnley's murder. Sir James Balfour, whose share in the tragedy was as active as that of Bothwell himself, remained in high office and honour in Edinburgh at the time. As did another of the actual murderers, Morton's cousin Archibald Douglas, afterwards Scottish ambassador in England, a scoundrel so corrupt as to be almost grotesque. There are great numbers of his letters testifying to this in the Hatfield papers. Hist. MSS. Com. 20. QAO, and then GDO III has a notation here that Mary abdicated under the duress of childbirth, threats of the letters, and her own life. GDO III put a big exclamation mark here. So she was trapped, basically. Can you see this is one of those stories that has many chapters? Chief characters with notes from GDO III. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Twins delivered, January 1, 1568, at Loch Leven. Mary, Queen of Scots, returns to good health. No outside reports about Mary from December 15, 1567, to February of 1568. James VI of Scotland. gifts of Mary's will prior to James' birth. It was customary back then for women to make out their will before childbirth, because many women did not survive childbirth. Mary's 3 knights: Lord Bothwell, James Ormiston, Robert Ormiston, James Ormiston's uncle, 2 to 3 assassins of Riccio Rizzio. All of the Lochleven family: Margaret Sinclair, James V, Mary's father; Lord James Stuart, afterwards Earl of Moray, her illegitimate brother, leader of the Protestant pro-English party; Lord John Stuart, commendator of Coldingham, also illegitimate brother; Lord Robert Stuart, Abbot of Holyrood, also illegitimate brother; the Duke of Châtelherault, head of the Hamiltons and next heir to the throne, also known as Arran; the Earl of Arran, his son, a strong Protestant Hamilton with mental problems; Lord John Hamilton, another son, Gideon III put. Here, Gavin Hamilton, Abbot of Kilwinning, a cousin to the Duke, Catholic; John Hamilton, the Catholic Primate of Scotland, the 4th Earl of Lennox, also known as Matthew Stuart, a Catholic with pretensions to the throne; father of Lord Darnley, also known as the King Henry; Margaret Douglas, his wife, Henry Stuart; Lord Darnley, his son, a Catholic; husband of Mary Stuart; all the Ruthvens and Lindsays, the Carmichaels, the thugs of Riccio's murder, and those with Mary; others, the Lochleven family, all; Captain John Stuart Carmichael, Isgard, Traquair; Archibald Douglas, Balfour, his brother; the surviving Huntleys, Gordons, various others with her during imprisonment. 21. The Sinclairs, Caithness. Certain Scots, those at her Lochleven escape: Lady Fleming, Maitland. Cow. Mary's first attempt to escape Lochleven was not successful, but she was assisted on the second try. It can hardly be called an escape, because she is really on an island on this big lake, which is not that far offshore. All she needed was a little boat to take her from one side to the other. She was imprisoned there, supposedly for her involvement in the killing of Darnley. But she is really there to carry out her pregnancy, and have her baby or babies, and to be out of sight. The world thinks she's being held captive on charges against her. Gideon III believes a few weeks after the twins are born, they are smuggled off the island to a monastery in France, which was run by one of Mary's aunts. A few weeks later, Mary attempts an escape, but is caught, and brought back to Lochleven. On the second attempt, she makes it across the lake. Some say it was not really an escape. The lords had chosen to let her go. She did have some assistance from one of her keepers from the Douglas family. He helped her escape, and then, basically, she was on the run after that, truly on the run because Bothwell was gone,